Paul Dennis Reid, known as the fast food killer, terrorized Nashville, Tennessee and surrounding Davidson County in the late 90s. At the height of his rampage, fast food locations across Davidson County would close early out of fear for their employees, or they were forced to close at night because they could not find workers willing to risk their safety. The picture that would emerge of Reid in the following years is a bit murky. Reid was the product of a confused and violent childhood. He has suffered multiple brain injuries when he was still young, and he struggled with claimed and real mental illness. The judge in his final appeal at the Supreme Court of Tennessee at Nashville would pose this question: is Paul Reid a mentally ill man who tries to appear sane, or a sane man who tries to appear mentally ill? Hi guys, I'm Kevin and welcome to Just Thought Lounge. This channel is all about thought-provoking true crime cases. I source most of my content from court documents when available to provide detail and accuracy. Now, I'm a new channel and just finding my feet, so I do welcome any thoughts or feedback that you have for me in the comment section below. But without further delay, here's the story of the maybe crazy fast food killer. Reid was born in Texas on the 12th of November 1957. He had two older sisters, Linda and Janet. Reid's home life was unstable. His father, Paul Reid Sr., was an alcoholic who was frequently absent from the home. Because Reid's father was away from home so much, him and his sister lived with their paternal grandmother, who had difficulties disciplining them. By the age of about 4 or 5, Reid was causing problems in the neighborhood. He was also seriously misbehaving at home. He stole mail from the neighbors, stole clothes from the neighbors' clotheslines, put tacks in his grandmother's soup, barricaded his grandmother in her room, set fire to her bed while she was still in it, and beat her dog to death with a baseball bat. Reid did not start school until he was about 7 years old. Having a difficult time with his studies, he was referred to the school psychologist and was diagnosed as suffering from minimal cerebral dysfunction linked to brain damage. Reid returned to live with his mother after she learned that he was to be put up for adoption. This lasted until he was 16, when he was asked to leave after he attempted to sexually assault his sisters and his mother. As time passed, Reid would continue to build upon his juvenile record, racking up a variety of charges from check forgery to simple assault to automobile theft. His crimes escalated until in 1982 he was charged with committing several armed robberies in Texas. He was never tried on these charges, however, because he was hospitalized after being found incompetent. Reid's lifestyle would eventually catch up with him, though, as he was convicted in Texas of aggravated robbery and would be sent to prison. Reid would serve only 7 years of his 20-year sentence in Texas before being released. The year was 1997, and he made his way to Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee is known as Music City and America's country music capital. Not surprisingly, the city also has a tradition of influencing the development of music in America. Notable stars like Carrie Underwood, Keith Urban, and Taylor Swift have homes in the area. Back in 1997, it had a population of just under 700,000, and the city was still a hub for the country music elite. It was to this city that Reid had moved to pursue his own career as a country music star. Whilst pursuing his dream, Reid found employment at Shoney's restaurant, where he worked until February of 1997, only weeks before the first shooting would occur at Captain D's. On the morning of the 16th of February, a Sunday, around 9:45 a.m., Michael Butterworth arrived for work at the Captain D's restaurant on Lebanon Road in Donelson, Tennessee. He found that he was unable to enter the restaurant because the doors were locked. So, Michael telephoned the Captain D's from a neighboring restaurant, but received a busy signal. When he called a second time a few minutes later, no one answered. Believing that something was wrong, Michael contacted another employee whose father was a Metro police officer. The employee's father, Officer Jeff Wells, arrived at the restaurant and, after the assistant manager unlocked the door, entered to find 25-year-old manager Steve Hampton and 16-year-old Sarah Jackson dead. Both were lying face down on the floor inside the walk-in cooler. Steve Hampton was a husband and father of 3, the youngest only 3 years old and the eldest 8 at the time of his death. Steve had been a good father. He was also the only child of his mother, Paula Sue Guidry, who was so devastated by her son's death that she said she would simply never recover. Sarah Jackson, a high school student working only part-time, was described by family members as intelligent, fun-loving, and happy. Sarah loved children. Both of Sarah's parents would struggle with guilt following her death for allowing her to work. They believed she would be safe at the neighborhood Captain D's. She was killed only 2 days before her 17th birthday. Both Sarah and Steve were shot execution style. They had been forced inside the cooler and made to lie on the floor. Steve had been shot twice in the back of the head and once in the back. Sarah had been shot 4 times in the head and once in her back. According to the medical examiner, 2 of Sarah's head wounds were fatal, but the other 2 head wounds were superficial, and the shot to the back would not have been immediately incapacitating. If these less serious wounds had been inflicted first, the examiner testified that Sarah may have been able to move, and in fact, a blood pattern of her gloved hand on shelving near and above her body indicated that Sarah had attempted to pull herself up from the floor after she had been shot. $7,140, including $250 in coins, was taken in the robbery. Steve Hampton's wallet, which contained $600 that he had intended to use to pay rent, was also missing. In the following days, Reid would make a down payment for a new car with that money. Michael Butterworth and another employee testified that a man came into the restaurant through the exit door around 10 p.m. shortly before closing the night before the murders. This man said he was interested in applying for a part-time job, and he worked just down the street at Shoney's. The man was given an employment application and told that the manager, Steve Hampton, would be working the next day. He then asked if anyone else would be working that Sunday morning. This man was later identified as Reid. Less than a month later, on the 23rd of March, 4 McDonald's employees were wrapping up their shift at the restaurant on Donaldson Pike in Davidson County. Ronald Santiago, Andrea Brown, Robert Sewell, and Jose Ramirez Gonzalez. Reid had been waiting outside for the group to close up. As he saw them leaving, he forced them back inside the restaurant, demanding money. After Ronald Santiago, the manager, handed over the contents of the restaurant safe, Reid directed the employees into a storage area and ordered them to lie down on the floor. He then fired 2 shots each into the heads of Andrea, Ronald, and Robert. However, when Reid attempted to shoot Jose Gonzalez, the gun malfunctioned. Jose then struggled with Reid. During that struggle, Reid drew a knife and stabbed Jose repeatedly. Jose, thinking ahead, stopped fighting and feigned death, and when Reid had left, he was able to telephone for help. Ronald Santiago and Robert Sewell died at the scene. Andrea Brown passed later at the hospital. Dorothy Carter, the 911 emergency dispatcher who answered Jose's call, said she could only hear groans and mumbling on the other end of the phone. Although she was unable to communicate with the caller, she nonetheless dispatched both police and ambulance to the restaurant. Detective Mike Rowland, who investigated, found no fingerprints, shoe prints, or physical evidence linking Reid to the crime. He and other officers did find a Remington .25 caliber cartridge casing inside the restaurant, though. Testing established that casing matched the .25 caliber bullets that were recovered from the 3 murder victims. It would later be established that approximately 8 to 10 weeks before the crimes, Reid had purchased 2 .25 caliber automatic handguns and a box of ammunition that would be tied to the scene. Another central detective on the case, Pat Postiglione, worked with Jose to identify Reid as a central suspect via sketch artists and viewings of hundreds of photos over the months that followed. While detectives worked to piece together what bits of evidence were available, Reid was not finished terrorizing the fast food hotspots of Tennessee. On the night of the 23rd of April, Angela Holmes, age 21, and Michelle Mace, age 16, were working at a Baskin-Robbins on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard in Clarksville. The shop regularly closed at 10 p.m., so Craig Mace, Michelle's brother, arrived at the Baskin-Robbins shortly after 10 to collect his sister. He noticed that Angela's car was in the parking lot and that the lights inside the store were still on. He entered via an unlocked door and found no one inside. Craig then called 911. Officers found the cash register empty and the safe in the office had its top removed, so all signs suggested a robbery. In addition, a mop and buckets were found in the customer area and the freezer was left open, both indications that closing had not yet been completed. The next morning, the 24th of April, the bodies of Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace would be found at the Dunbar Cave State Natural Area in Montgomery County, Tennessee. The area is about 3 miles from the Baskin-Robbins. Both Angela and Michelle had suffered deep stab wounds to their necks, as well as stab wounds, cuts, and abrasions to other parts of their bodies. They had both bled to death. Angela was the mother to an infant daughter who would never know her mother. Craig Mace, Michelle's brother, said later that he had become angry, sad, and fearful, and that the death of his sister had left his father totally destroyed. Dr. Charles Harlan performed the autopsies on the bodies. He said that the fatal stab wound on Angela Holmes went all the way to her backbone. The compound incision that penetrated Michelle Mace's backbone consisted of changes in direction and so was consistent with a sawing motion. The worst part of these conclusions, if you can believe that it does get worse, is that Harlan testified that both victims would have taken 5 to 15 minutes to bleed to death and would have been conscious for 80% of that time. The police first considered Paul Reid a suspect on the 12th of June, nearly 2 months after Baskin-Robbins. This was after his arrest in Chatham County for allegedly attempting to kidnap the manager of Shoney's restaurant. From this arrest, police obtained Reid's fingerprints and photograph. Although none of his fingerprints were found at Captain D's, several items belonging to Steve Hampton were discovered 1 day after the murders lying alongside Ellington Parkway, which is a 4-lane highway in East Nashville. Among the items found was a movie rental card belonging to Hampton. Reid's right thumbprint would be found on that card. The Captain D's case would be tried first. The Baskin-Robbins case was tried next, and the McDonald's was last. Reid's convictions and sentences were all affirmed in the direct appeal process in the same order as the trials. After the first conviction, Reid's counsel began entering evidence and expert testimony of his mental state. It was asserted that Reid's strong desire to appear normal resulted in his insistence that certain mitigating evidence not be presented on his behalf. The jury sentenced Reid to death on each conviction in the first-degree murder in the Captain D's case, and then again for each count in the Baskin-Robbins case. The assistant district attorney who prosecuted Reid in the Texas case said that during these proceedings, Reid performed antics whenever the jury was present, but then would stop putting on when the jury was not in the courtroom. Reid's sister Janet would recall that her brother became paranoid after he was imprisoned in Texas. She also described some bizarre instances when he had been joking and acting silly following his father's funeral. Reid apparently joked around with a Burger King crown on his head and called himself King Paul. This was only months following the fast food killings, though Reid had obviously not yet been caught. Years later, Reid would brag to one of his psychologists that he had fooled the shrinks and told another that he had faked delusions in the past. So, was Reid crazy? And if so, exactly how crazy was he? Well, Dr. Amador, a clinical psychologist, had found that Reid suffered from multiple conditions: chronic schizophrenia of the paranoid type, documented brain damage, mental illness associated with brain dysfunction, and a cognitive disorder not otherwise specified. According to the doctor, Reid also had a personality change of a combined type caused by head trauma and characterized by aggressive and impulsive behavior. After several death sentences had been handed down, the court and the public were told that Reid had structured his mental state around one central delusion. He had the long-standing belief that for over 20 years, he has been under constant surveillance by a secret government agency. These secret agents recorded him and bugged his car and home. He believed, according to the doctor, that he had been chosen for this surveillance because of some special qualities that he possessed. Apparently, his relationship to this delusion is also confused. At times, he would describe feeling tortured and paranoid about the secret activity, but at other times, he would speak of his great loyalty to this agency. Dr. Amador believed that Reid was suffering from a symptom of psychosis in which a person with a brain injury compulsively attempts to prove that he or she does not have a mental illness and is desperate to have people believe that he is normal. Now, Dr. Amador was not the only psychologist to spend time with Reid and weigh in on his mental state. Several credible experts assessed Reid, including Dr. Pamela Abel, a clinical neuropsychologist who testified that Reid's brain damage showed a shrunken left temporal lobe, which is basically the area of the brain that controls both language and behavior. The damage left him, in her words, shrunken and distorted. It also caused a psychotic disorder with delusions, difficulty thinking, as well as aggression. These medical opinions are not the whole story, of course. It's not that simple. When the state presented their experts to assess Reid's competency, a Dr. Woods would frame both the brain damage as well as the delusions in a less severe light. Dr. Woods believed Reid's delusions were not the result of psychosis, but rather organic in nature. He certainly suffered from delusions, sure, but these were secondary to his brain dysfunction. Similarly, Dr. William Burnett, an expert in forensic psychiatry, would testify that Reid used fantasy in making up stories and then telling these stories in a very adaptive way. This is a defense mechanism. It's a psychological defense mechanism that protects him from very, very unpleasant ideas and unpleasant feelings. That's very helpful to people. We all use defense mechanisms, although most people don't use the ones that he uses. And I think that the government surveillance idea protects him against the idea that he killed people and that he was found guilty of killing 7 people. Because it's very simple that if only that government surveillance could be located, it would prove that I didn't do it. And so I think that fantasy is very useful to him. We take to January 2013 before the Supreme Court at Nashville made its final decision on competency for Reid following his multiple convictions, death sentences, and appeals. The decision would call Reid a conundrum. On one hand, he is undeniably brain damaged. A lesion on his left temporal lobe interferes with his ability to communicate and possibly compromises his grip on reality. Mr. Reid claims that he subscribes to a series of elaborate delusions in which he is the subject of constant governmental surveillance and remote mind control. He insists that his trials were mock trials, that the attorneys representing him were actors, and that his death sentence was actually a secret 10 to 12-year sentence. In addition, he has claimed that he's engaged to a woman who his psychiatrists believe is a figment of his imagination. On the other hand, Mr. Reid had told several mental health professionals over the years that his delusions are actually elaborate, self-serving hoax that he has successfully employed to avoid prosecution in the past. Does he truly believe he is trapped in an Orwellian nightmare of government surveillance and thought control, or are his delusions more like an elaborate piece of performance art used to gain attention and to amuse himself while in prison? Perhaps it is a bit of both. Paul Reid has proved to be a tough nut to crack. All of the key experts testifying in Reid's competency appeals came to slightly different conclusions. Because of this, his appeals were unsuccessful and his convictions and death sentences were upheld. The courts concluded that in light of the divergent diagnoses related to Reid's idiosyncratic behavior, It was not an error for the courts to have substantial doubt over Reid's incompetency and ability to make decisions, but he could not prove that he did not know what he was doing, or that he did not understand the consequences of his actions. The man was unstable, violent, and disturbed. On these points, everyone essentially agreed. But to what extent was he physically brain damaged or mentally incapable? It remained unclear. Reid was set an execution date of April 29, 2003. With appeals lingering, Reid would have this date pushed by roughly another decade, and by 2013, when our Supreme Court opinion of Reid as a conundrum is offered, he would be only months away from death, but not by the prison executioner. He died in Nashville General Hospital on the 1st of November, 2013, from causes due to pneumonia, heart failure, and respiratory issues. He had been in the hospital for about 2 weeks. So that is the story of the fast food killer. What do you think? Was he faking insanity? How much do you think his brain damage and potential insanity impacted his actions? And should they have influenced his sentencing? I'm really looking forward to reading through your thoughts on this one in the comments below. And thanks again for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I'll see you guys in the next one.